Well, welcome back. And the first thing I want to do is to thank our break sponsor, Pillsbury, for laying on such a good spread. This session, we're going to be discussing what President Obama has described as the defining issue of our age, which is inequality. And to discuss it, we have probably two of the greatest experts and greatest economic minds around. First, I'd like to invite onto the stage Martin Feldstein, who, as well as being sort of emeritus president of the National Bureau for Economic Research for many years, was also Ronald Reagan's chief economic advisor, and has written extensively on many issues, and is the sort of man that I think we periodically have said should be running the Federal Reserve, among other things. So Martin, welcome. Thank you. And then, yes, round of applause. And I'd like to call on Joe Stiglitz, who is a Nobel laureate in economics. Joe, please join us. A prolific troublemaker in the economic field and author of many books, including the one that you very generously brought on to show off right now, which is The Price of Inequality, How Today's Divided Society Endangers Our Future, and obviously a must-read book on the topic. Joe. So I was, in preparing for this session, I read a couple of things. One is The Economist, which is an excellent magazine, and it had a cover 2 weeks ago called True Progressivism, the New Politics of Capitalism and Inequality, and featured in the middle a 14-page special report by Zanny Minton-Beddoes, which is as good as anything you'll ever read on the topic. So I do recommend, except for The Price of Inequality, which strangely wasn't mentioned in the special report. But anyway, please do read that if you haven't done. And then I also read an article that Marty wrote in the Public Interest in the fall of 1999 called Reducing Poverty, Not Inequality, where you really make the case that actually we shouldn't be worried about inequality at all, that the real issue is poverty, and we should be finding a solution to that, and the distributional questions are not really worth worrying about. And many of the increases in inequality that we see are the result of all sorts of economic forces that are largely rewarding progress, such as people getting paid more for the skills that they've invested in acquiring, and globalization creating a bigger marketplace, and so forth, better tax systems that reward wealth creation. And so I wanted, before we started, to actually just get a sense of where you are as an audience. And if we could have the house lights up for a second. I mean, we hear a lot about the 99% versus the 1%. I just want to get a sense from you in the audience. Do you think that when we talk about the 99% versus the 1%, that we're talking about anything significant? Does that ratio actually matter? Does it tell us anything useful? If you think it does, could you raise your hands? Okay, and if you think it's just a meaningless piece of jargon, could you raise your hands? So I would say pretty evenly spread, but slightly more people feel it matters than didn't. And while we're on ratios, let me just pick another ratio and say, how many people think the 47% is significant as an indicator of anything? Can you raise your hand if you think the 47% that Mitt Romney mentioned in a private gathering matters? Okay, and how many think it doesn't matter? It doesn't tell us anything significant. Okay, so, well, gentlemen, you kind of got a sense of our audience, and I really want to start with you, Joe. If you would just sort of spell out to us, why does inequality matter to you? Why is it an issue that we should take seriously?
Okay. Well, first, let me say, in the next 4 minutes, I'm not going to be able to summarize my book, so you'll have to get it to figure out the full story. But I do want to also say that the Economist article by Zoe, the series
by
of
Zanny,
articles, Zanny, were really good, and do provide and remarkably, while the Economist and I have often disagreed on different things, the views that they express are very similar to ones I take. And the big point here is a couple of one. inequality has really risen significantly in the United States to the level not seen for a very long time. And it's not only inequality in income, inequality in wealth, in health, in a whole variety of dimensions. And it's not just that some are doing better than others. It's the fact that while the top is doing very well, the median, the people in the middle, are actually not doing very well. So the old notion of a rising tide lifts all boats from trickle-down economics hasn't been working. One aspect that I think the Economist found disturbing, and I find very disturbing, is that one of the things that most Americans feel strongly about is opportunity. So they may say it's not so important equality of outcome, but what is important is equality of opportunity. We think of America, the American dream. And the data suggests that that has become a myth, that among the advanced countries, not only is the United States the country with the most inequality of income, but it's also among the countries with the least equality of opportunity. And that has two important messages. One, the fact that different countries have different degrees of equality and equality of opportunity mean that it's not just market forces. The same market forces, the laws of supply and demand, are operating on both sides of the Atlantic and the Pacific, but the way those market forces are shaped have a lot to do with our legal frameworks, our tax laws, our expenditures. And so decisions that have been made in different countries have led to these markedly different outcomes. Now, the second important point is that in the manner in which inequality has been created in the United States and the extremes of inequality in the United States are such that regardless of what your moral views and your attitudes towards what is a good society or fair distribution of income, the fact is that that level of inequality and that manner of inequality generation is bad for the economy. So it's, that if you are concerned about how well our economy functions, it's reached a level and a form which is destructive. One aspect there are several reasons for this. One that comes out as a direct corollary of the point that we have become the country, or among the countries with the least equality of opportunity, is that we aren't using our human resources as well as we should. If you happen to be born at the bottom of the income distribution, your likelihood that you won't be able to live up to your potential is just very high. So that's one example, but many other examples. Poor people are exposed to more environmental hazards, and therefore the likelihood that they will be born low birth weight, and that will have effects on lifetime income and then on their children. So out of this comes, out of the concerns about the consequences of lack of opportunity, and one of the things that both your report emphasized and my book emphasizes, a lot of the inequality, not all, but a lot of the inequality has to do with rent-seeking activity, monopolies, and other distortions in the market economy. So reducing those distortions reduces inequality and at the same time increases the efficiency of the economy.
We'll come back to discuss some of those issues in a moment. Straight over to you, Marty. Why do you think inequality doesn't matter?
Oh, well, I don't think that. And so
I think you've won this conversation.
What I said in the article and what I continue to believe is that inequality is very important. It's substantively important. It's not just a political issue. It's an ethical issue. But what I don't believe is that the Gini coefficient or other general measures of the ratio of incomes at the 90th percentile to the 50th percentile. I don't see that as really the important aspect of inequality. To me, the important aspect of inequality in the United States is about poverty, and it's about low incomes and low wealth. Let me say a brief word about the top, though, because I agree with what Joe said and what the article said, that if people who have very large incomes and accumulate a lot of wealth have been able to do so because of corruption, because of cronyism, because of special monopoly privileges that have been given to them, that's a bad thing. And again, I think The Economist magazine was quite clear in saying that's a very big problem in many of the emerging market countries. We hear about it in China, we know about it in Latin America. It's not nearly the kind of problem here that it is there. But I think to the extent that there is that source of it, then I think there's something to worry about at the top. But high incomes, fairly earned, I see no problem with. So let me focus on poverty. And I think there are really two aspects of that. One is poverty in old age. I think it's really shocking that we spend about $500 billion a year on Social Security, and yet we have many, many old people in poverty. We have a supplemental security income program, which is means tested, but it doesn't do the job of getting rid of that poverty. And then the other poverty issue is what happens to young people and to families. And there it's, again, and I think The Economist magazine brings it out, it's our educational system that is not preparing people of lesser ability for decent jobs where they can support a family. And so I think that's a serious problem. When it comes to wealth, most Americans simply have no wealth at all. They count on Social Security for their retirement. They count on unemployment insurance to support them if they lose their jobs temporarily, but they have no liquid wealth. And I think that's a serious problem. But I see I'm over the time, and so I should stop, and we'll come back to these issues, I'm sure.
Well, I think the first place we might want to look is this question of to what extent the current prosperity of the 1% is due to rent-seeking behavior in the US versus wealth creation. And my sense is, Joe, I mean, you feel it's a lot more to do with cronyism and rent-seeking, and you think it's much more to do with entrepreneurial, sort of legitimate market outcomes and so forth. Joe, what's your evidence?
Well, let me say, it's very hard to parse this out precisely. And one of the reasons, again, I explain in the book, is that the two can often be interlinked together. So you have an entrepreneur who makes a discovery, but then goes over the line and has made important contributions, but uses anti-competitive practices, leverages the patent monopoly to get real monopoly. And, 'cause the basic premise in economics, markets are competitive. The problem with competition is it's not very interesting. Competition competes away profits, and you don't get huge amounts of wealth. So that the persistence of large amounts of wealth usually comes from creating one form of entry barrier or another. It's one of the things that we try to teach in the business school, how to do it, but to try to do it within the law. And we know that.
But are you feeling we should, as part of your policy solution, to get rid of the patent system, or?
No, not to get rid of the patent system, but to be more forceful in enforcing competition law to make sure that there aren't these abuses. That's one example. And if you look at the people who are at the very top, several of them have certainly gotten it through exercise of monopoly power, anti-competitive practices, and figuring out what fraction of their income came from the anti-competitive practices versus what would have happened if the markets had been really competitive is a difficult question. Let me give you another area where the boundary is difficult to ascertain. The financial sector benefited a lot from deregulation. And part of that, there documented examples of discriminatory lending, which hurts the people at the bottom, took away a lot of their wealth in effect. There were abusive credit card practices, anti-competitive practices, market manipulation, and some of this was within the legal framework. Some of it was a stepping over.
But it didn't create personal wealth. I mean, it may have helped some banks, but it didn't create individuals.
It translated. It translates.
But the biggest fortunes were made by the hedge fund bosses who earned orders of magnitude more than.
Yeah, but several of the heads of the banks, some of the money filtered up, and several of the big among those who are very wealthy are those who help create these large institutions. I don't want to talk about particular people, but what I do want to point, in terms of the numbers of people at the top, that's an example. These are examples of where our legal framework has provided scope for an increase in inequality. And it's very pervasive in our legal structure. For instance, a bankruptcy law that says that credit default swaps and derivatives are the first claimants in the event of a bankruptcy is distorting the economy in the direction of increasing the financial sector. Whether you call it rent-seeking or whether you call it's a good legal framework is a matter that people can debate. But in the end, it's certainly when you have a bankruptcy law that says student loans can't be discharged even in bankruptcy, and that the first claimant, though, are the banks, are the credit default swaps, a legal framework like that has distribution consequences.
Could you imagine student loans as a market working if they were allowed to graduate from college and say, well, I have no money, so I'm going to declare bankruptcy?
No, but you could have had different. You could say you could have easier standards for default when. I mean, let me give you an example of a current law. And when I was going around talking my book, you really hear very poignant stories. A parent co-signs a loan. The kid dies of a disease or gets killed in an accident. The parent can't discharge the debt, even in bankruptcy. That's an extreme example of a legal framework that is, in my judgment, unbalanced.
But I mean, that if you just took a pure poverty perspective rather than an inequality perspective, you could address that problem if you wanted to make it slightly easier to get rid of the loan. But I want to come to you. I mean, what makes you feel so confident that the wealth disparities that have grown at the top over the last 25 years have been due to benign or actually forces that we would want to encourage to make society better off?
When people talk about the income disparities at the top, we don't have much data on wealth. What we have is data on income. But the data on income that we have is tax return data. So any of the household survey data are limited to numbers like $100,000 or 100. So if you want to know about the top 1/10 of 1%, then you have to look at the tax returns. But the tax returns are not in any sense reporting total income, let alone reporting it on the same basis that they did a couple of decades ago. As the tax law has changed, people who in the past might have reported some of their income through a corporation and some of it in their personal tax returns, the change in the tax laws after 1986 induced them to combine those. So suddenly there was a jump in the level of incomes.
Yeah, but the studies that, like Saïs, did a very careful analysis of precisely that shift. I mean, they were aware of this and tried to splice the data together.
I don't think there's any way to do it. I mean, we don't have the raw data with which to
But they can see the
But
jump
you-
when you change the law.
But you fundamentally, you don't think there's a lot of rent seeking going on in America?
That's a separate issue from the changing distribution. But no, I don't see a lot of rent seeking. There may be some, but I think, patents are intentional monopolies. We do that in order so if I invent a better clothespin.
There's still competition laws that say you aren't allowed to abuse it. And courts in the United States, Europe, and Asia have all convicted Microsoft of anti-competitive practices. I mean, so, yeah, they had intellectual property, but then the question is, what do you do with it?
So we have this situation where, according to Zani's survey, the 16,000 richest families in America earn 5% of the GDP. I'm interested, Joe, I mean, what's your suspicion as to what percentage of those 16,000, are making their money in a way that you could feel proud of as a capitalistic American, and what percentage of those 16,000 do you suspect are doing it through nefarious means or means that we should at least be trying to address with different policies?
I suspect that many or certainly a large fraction have a significant fraction of their incomes, or at least a fraction of their incomes, from legitimate means, and a fraction from rent seeking. And when you talk about, one aspect of this that sort of makes it more difficult and is sometimes included in the word rent seeking are the kinds of activities that are associated with tax avoidance activities that are available to that upper 0.1% that are not available to the rest, keeping money in offshore banking center, Cayman Islands, not because it's a place where the sunshine makes money grow faster. There are other reasons that people keep their money in the Cayman Islands that are less, you might call, that are more nefarious. So the issue, in some sense, is that this is why I said you can't parse it out cleanly, but what you see, and at least in a lot of cases, an element of rent seeking. Let me give you just another example.
That's not rent seeking. I mean,
using
if you use the tax law in a way that protects
but the laws, the point I guess I want to make is that the legal framework, including the tax laws, don't just come from heaven. They are shaped by the political system. And I think one of the concerns that I have raised in the book is that the high level of economic inequality almost inevitably spills over into something called political inequality and differences in voice.
You had to choose between dealing with this high income group, somehow cleaning up the law so that they had less wealth, the 16,000 families, was it? Or dealing with the poverty problem, which is where I think the emphasis ought to be. Do you want to see the next few years Congress worrying about how to tighten up on the 16,000 or deal with the poverty?
Well, I think they have to do both, and I also think
you to choose.
they have to.
I mean, this does seem to be, in a way, but I mean, this seems to be what the election debate, one of the themes has been, that there seems to be Romney who believes that going after the 1% would actually sort of hinder wealth creation and make the country less able to actually provide all the benefits that it offers to the 47%. And Obama takes a different view that you need to. The only way we can really actually close the gap is to tax the rich more heavily.
It's not a question just of taxing the rich more heavily. It's a question of having a less distorted tax structure, which would include taxing capital gains at least a fair rate, the same rate as ordinary income, so that people who work for a living pay the same taxes as somebody who speculates.
But again, I mean, I think the rationale for the lower rate of tax on capital gains is that encourages wealth creation activities.
Yeah, but so, I think people who work for a living, you want to encourage people people who are doing the basic research, discovering DNA, they're getting paid a salary. I think that's pretty important for somebody to have discovered DNA. And if I talk about, risk-taking, it took a lot of risk to be able to do that kind of research.
Let's hear from Marty.
When you teach your public finance students about the appropriate tax rate on investment income, not capital gains versus dividends and interest and all that, but investment income versus personal services income, do you teach them that they should be taxed at the same rate? I don't.
I'm not surprised that you don't.
But and I say, probably citing some of your earlier papers, that the distortion in the timing of saving that comes from taxing the returns to saving are an inefficiency in the economy.
Yeah, and the problem is that those simple models that I used 35 years ago don't really capture some essential aspects of the nature of the market economy. So I wrote a paper where I identified some of the market imperfections, imperfect information, imperfect risk markets, and then you get markedly different results. In particular, take one of the issues that has been debated right now, where I did write a paper in 1973, I do hope you teach it in your class, was the question of, in a tax code where you have a corporate income tax and you have the tax deductibility of interest, does that discourage investment? And if you look carefully at our tax structure, including the provisions for depreciation, it's probably the case that our corporate income tax actually does not discourage investment. And that if you wanted to encourage investment, you wouldn't do it by a cross-the-board tax cut. You would do it by targeting and saying, I'm going to have investment tax credit that would be focused on encouraging investment, in particular an investment tax credit for investments in the United States.
Now, can I push you a bit on your refusal to choose between the two scenarios that we were offered? That I think, does it seem reasonable for me to say that if the president were to go after the 1% and really sort of try and cut down on many of the abuses that you've identified and to tax them more heavily, would it follow that they would probably reduce, at least in the short to medium term, their amount of wealth-creating activity in the US? And do you think that would harm the economy?
Yeah, I think if you did it right, and I say it goes back to if you really targeted rent-seeking, I actually think it would encourage economic activity and real wealth creation. I think it would actually stimulate the economy.
What would be a legislative change that would target rent-seeking?
Well, among the things would be more effective enforcement of antitrust laws, changing corporate governance laws so that, for instance, there was real say in pay, so you get less of the excessive CEO pay, so that more of the corporate revenue could be reinvested in R&D and investment.
I think the share of total profits that is represented by CEO pay is a minute number.
No, it's not only the CEO, but we're talking about the whole management team that's getting. But let me agree with you.
But I talk to a lot of business leaders, and they say, we're being demonized. Wealth creation is being demonized.
No, it's not. It's not, because what this is really saying is we want to encourage real innovation, not rent-seeking and not redistribute activities that move money from the bottom of the pyramid to the top. But let me go back to the fundamental issue here is we all concerned about equality of opportunity, not only at the bottom, but also in the middle. And it seems to me, and I absolutely agree with you, these kinds of things don't solve that problem, that there needs to be another agenda that needs to focus on things like education and access to health. If you don't have access to health when you're young, you can become easily scarred for life. So making sure that children get access to health seems to me something that is absolutely vital for this opportunity agenda.
Yeah, can I just turn? I mean, there's all on the other side. It is said that, if we were to go back to the tax rates of the Clinton era, that was a pretty good time for the U.S. economy. Would that actually? Would you? Is there really much grounds for opposing that kind of slightly higher rate of tax, sort of more equality between capital and income?
I think the right way to raise more revenue is by structural reforms of the tax code, by putting limits, not abolishing any of the deductions. I think politically that's difficult, but I think putting limits on the extent to which individuals, and when we're talking about deductions, you're talking about higher income individuals. 2/3 of taxpayers don't even itemize, so they don't get tax deductions in their tax return. I think that's the way to do it rather than pushing up tax rates. It's not that the world comes to an end if we raise the tax rates by 5 or 10 percentage points, but every little bit that you do has some adverse effect, and the extra revenue that you get is much less than the proportional increase in the tax rates. So I think there's a much better way to go in terms of base broadening, going after the tax expenditures.
But if we were to broaden the base and put up the marginal rates by 5% or something, would that be harmful particularly?
Well, it would be harmful. I mean, again, I'm saying these are not the world will come to an end. And what determines the growth rate over the next 10 years will depend on many things. But I think if you ask, will the economy perform better with 5% higher tax rates? Especially we're talking about taking them from, by the time you add together state and local, and city and federal, you're talking about people with 45, 50% starting rates. Pushing it up another 5 percentage points is not a good idea.
So I'm going to go in a moment to get questions from the audience, but I just wanted to push this one last question. That I guess I remember a conversation with Michael Bloomberg a few years ago before the financial crisis where he said he'd done a lot of surveys of how people felt about wealth in America. And at the time, he was saying the surveys overwhelmingly showed that people were happy with there being very rich people because they basically believed they could be rich too. And I think your subtitle is obviously about the death of the American dream. And I mean, how deep do you think that loss of faith in the ability to move up and make your fortune, how deep is that shift, and how true is it really that you can't work your way up from the top? I mean, it does strike me many of the new billionaires that we read about are people who certainly, they weren't maybe not coming out of the bottom 20%, but they certainly weren't coming out of the top 25%.
Now, let's make it clear that some people do make it from the bottom to the middle, the bottom to the top, middle to the top. Some people make it from the top down. And the nature of mobility, if people are making a mobility matrix, if you go up, if somebody's occupying a spot at the top, somebody has to move down. So there are always going to be stories. One of the reasons why they're so salient, why you remember them, is that they're so unusual. You don't cover in the newspapers stories when a dog bites a person, but you do cover it when a person bites a dog. And
not in the Economist. That's another matter.
So the point is, yes, there are examples, and it's not an absolute barrier. But the question is, what matters for an economist or a social scientist is what is the likelihood, and what can we do to affect that likelihood? And the fact is that the likelihood of this upward mobility is much lower in the United States than in Scandinavia. The likelihood of it is lower today than it was before. The correlation, as I said before, between the income and education of a kid and his parents is much higher in the United States than in almost all of the other advanced countries. That has real social and economic implications. Now, the fact is that Americans don't yet fully grasp this. And there are lots of studies that have been done of what people's perception of the nature of our economy. And so under current circumstances, a lot of people still believe in the American dream.
You think they're wrong to at the moment?
I think they're wrong too. I mean, that is, they think we are a fair society.
Do you buy this?
No, I don't buy this. And I think it's interesting to ask, who are the CEOs of the top 500 companies and where did they come from? And lo and behold, they didn't come from wealthy families and they didn't all go to Harvard and Columbia and Yale. So I think when we judge that, there's a very concrete way of seeing what mobility is about. And for most people, that's the kind of route up. And if you don't make it to the top, it's the second or the third or the 10th guy in these large companies. And in that sense, we're a very open society.
It just doesn't show up in the statistics of the likelihood of somebody making it from the bottom to the top.
Yeah, I didn't say from the bottom. I didn't say from the bottom. No,
or even
probably
from the middle to the
in
top.
one generation.
If you look at the whole picture, U.S. does more poorly than most other countries.
I commend to you looking at the CEOs as a good test case.
I mean, I wonder, Joe, if you were to actually just take out from the statistics the people who were stuck in the worst performing schools, because I mean, in a sense, there's this whole raft of really underperforming inner city schools that you know, I think everyone would acknowledge, you know, they really have a very low probability of success in life. I mean, is that fundamentally, is that what explains most of the change in statistics?
Well, first of all, I don't want to exclude
so?
47% of America from our discussion. But no, I don't think it actually, it explains part of it. It explains part of it, but and you know, there are a number of other factors going on in the United States. I mean, the fact is that we are becoming more geographically segregated socioeconomically. The fraction of, you know, if you look at the fraction of well-off people that live near middle income or poorer people, our communities are becoming much more homogeneous than they used to, and that's spilling over into the nature of the educational opportunities. So there are things going on in our society that are having these adverse effects, but it's not just the failed schools.
What strikes me about the educational issue is when I listen to people talk about some of the experiments that are being done in poor schools, schools with poor achievement, schools where many of the kids drop out, they think about it as if they're training everybody to go to college. When for a lot of these kids, it would be much more useful at some point to say, you're going to need to have a job, and here are some of the kinds of skills that you would need to do that. But of course, that's not what teachers want to teach. They were brought up to teach English literature, and so they're going to teach English literature. But that's not where the jobs are, and I think we're seeing that now. So
before we turn over to the audience, I just wanted to quickly ask you to say, you know, what are your top 3 policy priorities for addressing the problem? And both of you, just so we get a sense of what the real differences are.
I think probably Marty and I agree on one of them, which is a better education system to make sure you get more educational opportunity. In terms of what we've been talking about, that's probably the most important. The second thing is our tax system is not as progressive as I think it should be. It's more distorted than it should be. Some of that is related. That is to say, I think some of the distortions lead to less progressivity and a more distorted economy. So I think we really need to rejigger our tax system and increase tax revenue so that we can spend more on education, preventing some of the environmental hazards, which are having very bad adverse on parts of our population. A whole set of things, more investment in technology that make our whole economy grow. And the third thing is the regulatory environment, which I think could make our economy both more dynamic, reduce rent seeking, and prevent some of the worst abuses where discrimination that contribute to poverty.
I wasn't sure if that was 3, but I'll try to limit mine to 3. Education, high on the list. But education, to me, means trying to educate/train people for market-oriented jobs, so that I think, if it happens, would also strengthen marriages and families and a variety of related things. Second, poverty, particularly poverty in old age. As I said, we spend $500 billion a year, and yet we still on seniors, on Social Security benefits, and yet we have large numbers of older people who are living in poverty. Something's wrong with that system, and it particularly affects women, and particularly affects women who become widowed or divorced at a relatively early age. If they don't have an income history of their own, the Social Security system fails them. Indeed, if you get divorced and you've been married for 10 years or more, you get to claim benefits on your former husband's income record. And the average time to divorce is 9 years. So something wrong with that system. And then the third thing is about wealth, that we don't encourage wealth accumulation. We don't encourage people to have personal retirement accounts, personal savings accounts that they can use when there are medical emergencies or unemployment emergencies. And I think we ought to both encourage and tax facilitate for middle and lower income people to accumulate liquid wealth.
Great. Well, if we could have the House lights up, we can turn over to the audience now. And I hope we're going to have lots of questions and comments. I'm going to take 2 or 3 at a time, and then we'll come back to the panel and do several rounds, hopefully. Could you say who you are as well, please?
Yes, I'm Jay Gould. I'm head of the investment funds practice at Pillsbury, a proud sponsor of this conference today. I was really interested in the 3 sort of policy initiatives that you laid out here, because those policy initiatives require, I would think, governmental action. But one thing that you haven't addressed, and I haven't bought your book yet, Mr. Stiglitz, so perhaps you address it there, is the Citizens United case, which now allows unchecked amounts of cash to flow into the political system and will distort any kind of policy choices that we have to make. I'd like to hear you comment on that.
Okay, and then over here.
Hi, my name's Seth Meltzer. Question geared a little bit maybe towards Martin based on your experience with President Reagan. I hate to bring a little bit of a political twist to it, but it has to do with inequality. We've been hearing President Obama defend his efforts to revive the economy for the past few years, and I've heard a number of Republicans say, well, President Reagan took over at a time that was a similar environment, and we were much better off by this time. And the lower, middle, and upper class were all doing better. So I'm curious if that, from your perspective, if that is the case. And then the second part to that is, do you hear either Governor Romney or President Obama saying anything that sounds somewhat similar to what President Reagan had done for the next 4 years?
Okay, great. And we'll take a question from Twitter as well, which is, why is it that, given everyone agrees, why, in the opinion of the panel, is education so woefully under-prioritized? Is it not the real core issue in inequality? Joe, you go first.
Okay, first, I couldn't agree with you more about the problem presented by Citizens United, both in terms of the way it affects our politics and the confidence that we have in our political system. When I said before that economic inequality feeds into political inequality, and then that feeds back into economic inequality, Citizens United is an example of a part of that vicious circle, which is, I think, undermining our democracy, and it's one of the themes I talk about in my book. There are two ways of dealing with that. Change the Supreme Court, and we know how we can, what has to be done about that. The second way, there are some things that have been discussed. Senator Schumer has talked about this. For instance, in the corporate governance laws, tax laws, that would basically say, for instance, that state law would say that you aren't allowed to give a campaign contribution for political action of this kind without a vote of the shareholders. You know, after all, the shareholders are supposed to be owning the corporation. Shouldn't they have a say in the pay of the CEOs? And shouldn't they have a say in the political actions of the corporation? And you could also do tax policy to say what is tax deductible and what is not. Let me answer a question, make a comment on the third question on why education has not been emphasized. Actually, President Obama has talked about it a lot. One of the reasons it's not emphasized as much as I think it should is, to a large extent, historically, it's been at the responsibility at the local level, and it's not a national issue. And then there's a debate about that's a big deal to change the locus of responsibility from the local level to the national level, but there are large geographical inequalities, and I think there is probably, given the nature and the magnitude of that inequality has risen, I think it ought to be more of a federal, there ought to be more of a federal role.
Marty?
Well, I think it is a local issue. I would hate to see it moving to a federal level. I think the Economist magazine has stressed the role of the teachers' unions. I think we need a fundamental re-examination of what education is supposed to be about for the people whom it's not serving well.
It does seem interestingly that 46 states have now signed up to a Common Core set of curriculum now, which is
and I wonder whether it's the right
partnership.
curriculum. You know,
Right.
that is, it's the right curriculum if you want what? Literacy,
Numeracy, that kind of thing.
numeracy.
But you
Those
also
are all
want
fine
cognitive
things.
abilities and creativity, and
Yes, you want all that, but
and also
people used to have pretty mundane production line jobs which have gone away. Some of them have gone offshore. Most of them have simply been replaced by machines. And so what do you do for people who would have had those jobs, not as intellectually demanding? Do the Europeans have it right? Do the Germans or the Swiss, who have much lower unemployment rates in West Germany or in Switzerland than we do they have it right by having apprenticeship programs and industry training programs, as opposed to saying everybody should have a curriculum which prepares them to go on to college?
Do you want to answer the question about the Reagan years? And
Yeah,
so?
well, I came in the summer of 1982, and the economy was in recession. And there'd been a lot of optimistic statements by my predecessor and others in the Reagan administration. A lot of joking about rose-tinted glasses, rosy scenario, and all that. So I was very cautious in making my prediction about what the economy would do, which is why I remember it very well. Here we were in recession, and I hated the thought of saying in my first forecast that the first quarter out would still be in recession. So I bravely said it would grow at 1%. And then I said, we don't really need to know what the quarter by quarter growth is going to be. Macroeconomic policy was to be handled by the Federal Reserve and Paul Volcker. We needed to know the long term, and long term then meant 5 years, forecast, because that's what governed budget decisions. So I said we would grow at 4% for the next 5 years.
And this was a number you plucked out of thin air?
No, it was a number that no, it was a carefully considered number that said by the end of 5 years we'd be back at full employment.
And look at how deep it was,
And
the
you look at
hole.
where you started, and then you figured out that you could, this is what it would take, 4% a year, on average, over those years. Well, of course, it grew at something like 8% in the first year, and everybody said, oh, what a pessimist Marty was. It's going to keep growing at 8%. And that made it harder to get some of the tax reforms that we needed. But I think the short answer is there was a very sharp increase in those early couple of years of the Reagan presidency. And there had been sharp reductions in personal taxes and in corporate taxes in immediate in 81. And within a couple of years, the economy was bouncing back. There were a lot of other things.
Can I say, one of the critical things was that Volcker had raised interest rates to, I think,
Double-digit levels.
double-digit levels, and he had a long way to bring them down, and that stimulated the economy.
So you
when
had
you have
both
interest
going
rates at
forward.
zero, you don't have much room to bring them down.
But
So I think monetary policy was the main.
Well, I think both contributed to it, and I think the evidence after the 86 tax cut was that the lower rates in 86, which took the top rate down from 50% to 28%, led to a sharp increase in taxable labor income, taxable income more generally, in the years after that.
Now, the Reagan-Thatcher period was associated with this term trickle-down economics, with the notion that the rich get richer and that'll make everyone else better off. Do you think that has stood the test of time very well, that theory?
Well, I think it certainly happened then, and I don't know how long the trickle is supposed to last.
Joe?
No, well, obviously, trickle-down economics hasn't worked in the last 15, 20 years. That, as I said before, median income today, and median income in today is lower than it was a decade and a half ago. And the median income, even before the crisis, so I don't want to confound the effects of the crisis, median income in 2007 was lower than it was in 1997, a decade earlier.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions. There's a lady right at the back. Yeah.
Lynn Forrester to Rothschild. Simple, short question. Is there any justification from the right or from the left for taxing carried interest as capital gains?
Okay,
guess
completely
Joe's
disinterested question there, but anyway, there's somewhere else down the front. There was a gentleman who wanted to speak. Here we go, right at the front. In the middle here. Pass the mic along.
Yeah, Daniel Andaluce from PricewaterhouseCoopers. I'm a Spanish national, so you need to understand how I'm going to formulate this question and why I'm especially
Could you keep it very short, though?
Yeah. Do you see in a scenario where the crisis continues and the inequality continues and governments are not able to fix the problems, whether this may suppose a risk for democratic systems, especially concerned about Europe?
Great, and one more question. There's a lady in the middle there, on this side. Great.
If both of you could respond to, given the option of eliminating the mortgage interest deduction in exchange for a liquid savings deduction, would you be in favor?
And one of the, I think, most striking statistics in Zanni's piece was that the top, the countries, the taxpayer, or the government spends 4 times as much subsidizing the homes of the richest 20% than it does on public housing for the bottom 20%. Marty, could you first of all help? Is there any justification on the carried interest?
Yeah, if you ask me to make the case, I would say that it has the same kind of uncertainty, the same kind of risk characteristics of other capital gains investments, and that would be why it should not be be taxed at the same rate that you would tax dividends or.
So the notion this is just salaried income is
well, it's got a lot more variability and uncertainty to it. You are a part owner of a potential income stream which may or may not materialize. On the third question,
yes.
On the mortgage question, my view about the right way to do the reform is not to try to take away the mortgage deduction or the state and local income tax deduction or any of those. I think the supporters of each of those policies, as they are today in the law, would fight it so much that there'd be no way of getting it. And so what I have been talking to people about is putting an overall cap on the total amount to which individuals can benefit from these various special tax provisions, the home mortgage, the exclusion of employer payments for health insurance, and so on. So nothing would be eliminated. Everybody could have all of the deductions they have today, but they just can't be too greedy about it. So when you add it all up, it can't amount to a tax saving of more than a few percentage points of your adjusted gross income. And obviously the magnitude of that percentage point could differ by income levels, and exactly what gets covered would have to be negotiated. But I think the key idea is not to take away something like the mortgage deduction or the charitable income deduction, but rather to put an overall cap on the total amount to which taxpayers can benefit from it.
I just want to get you to answer those two questions first, then we'll finish on the political risk scenario.
Yeah, I think there's no good justifications for the special treatment of carried interest. And there are lots of activities that are risky. Lots of wage jobs are risky. Research, somebody who is a researcher, if he's successful, he can have a big benefit. In terms of the things that really made a big difference, people who've done research, discovered DNA, discovered.
So you'd like to see just the capital and income treatment?
Yeah, I think fine-tuning to say that particular kind of activity deserves special treatment, and people who actually make a contribution to the basis of our society, like transistors and lasers and DNA, should not be treated favorably. I think that's absurd.
But you'd be happy to see venture capitalists taxed more heavily as well for their...
Everybody should be taxed at the same rate and recognize that
what about the mortgage deduction?
What?
The mortgage deduction.
The mortgage deduction, I think there were two aspects to the question. Marty's right that it's going to be very difficult to get rid of all treatment of say, special treatment of real estate. I think it is very distorting. But the real question is, what is the best way, if you're going to keep something of this, what is the best way of dealing with it? And that's what I thought part of the question was dealing with. If you're going to keep a mortgage deduction, one ought to not only cap it, but change it from a deduction to a credit, because that avoids some of the the inequities that you described. But I think the movement towards a program that would encourage home ownership, I think I alluded to this before, home ownership rather than debt, so you're increasing equity, encouraging people to save, perhaps matching in some way or giving equity contribution, is a better way of doing it than encouraging more indebtedness.
Okay, so to finish off, we had this question raised at the front about the political context of or consequences of inequality. And it seems to me if we extrapolate recent trends, which may not be the right thing to do, but if we did, we're going to see the rich get a lot richer relative to the median population, certainly in America and Europe over the next few years, probably the next decade at least. There's nothing that makes one feel that these recent patterns are going to go into reverse unless there's very dramatic political intervention. At what point does that start to become, the stuff of revolution, the stuff of, people wanting to throw out the existing system, attack the 1%, take it back and distribute? Is it that volatile mix?
Well, let me first say, I don't think it's just inequality. I think there is something about seeing what's happening to other people that is of concern. But I think of even more concern in the United States is that the people in the middle and the bottom have not been doing very well. So it's that a few people are doing very well at the top and going up, and trickle-down economics hasn't been working, and they're actually getting worse off. And when we talk about worse off, I think we should try to understand it's not just in terms of income. Our income measures really don't measure well-being in certain important dimensions. There's a lot of elements of insecurity that don't get captured in our GDP or income statistics. So I think I don't think Americans have been fairly peaceful, and I think hopefully it will take the form of political expression that we need to change. In the case of Spain, I think the issues are a little bit more difficult in a way because Spain is in depression. The EU has formulated, or the Eurozone has formulated a set of policies in which there is no light at the end of that tunnel. They continue to advocate more austerity that will make things worse, and it predictably did make things worse, and things have come out as I anticipated. Probably Marty would agree with it, came out as he would have anticipated. But the Euro leaders seem continually surprised that GDP has gone down as much as they thought. They thought austerity was going to lead to more growth. There'd be some confidence fairy that would come in and lead to economic growth. So in Spain,
in a sentence, can you just
in Spain, I am worried about it. But the form there, I think it's going to take is weakening national unity. I think the movement in Catalonia, in the Basque Country, are going to really put strains on Spanish national unity.
Okay, and Marty, very briefly, a last word to you. Do you worry about
With the United States, no. I think that in the United States, Americans are going to continue to say, it's okay if Joe is rich, if only I can get a little richer. And the emphasis is not on egalitarianism as such. It's not about whether the other guy is doing well, but what's happening in my household. So I think we're not going to see that kind of political.
But what's happening in his household is going down, and opportunity is going down.
Okay, well, there's another definition of it. There's another definition of inequality, which is when the moderator sees out of the corner of his eye his boss looking at his watch and thinking about having a drink. And on that note, I will thank the panel for being very stimulating and leave the stage.